In 1997, the Milburn Hotel in New York City became infamous for something other than its luxurious suites. Guests had always spoken of strange occurrences: a door that wouldn't stay shut, footsteps echoing in the halls at odd hours, lights flickering for no apparent reason. But it wasn't until a young woman named Claire checked in that the hotel's darkest secret began to unravel. Claire was a travel journalist, used to spending countless nights in unfamiliar hotels, but there was something about the Milburn that made her uneasy from the start. The room she was assigned, room 308, felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, and smelled faintly of mildew, even though it appeared spotless. The hotel manager, an older man with tired eyes, handed her the key with a stiff smile. But when Claire asked if everything was all right, he just muttered, "It's an old place. Things happen." Her first night there was restless. The bed, though plush, felt oddly constricting. She would drift into a half-sleep only to be jolted awake by the sensation of someone standing over her. Each time, the room was empty. When she turned off the lights, the darkness seemed to press in around her, suffocating and thick. And then there was the knocking. It started at around 2 a.m. Faint at first, just a subtle tap on the walls. At first, Claire thought it might be from the room next door, but it quickly became clear that the sound was coming from inside her own room. It wasn't rhythmic, but sporadic, like someone trying to get her attention. Heart racing, she turned on the bedside lamp and looked around. Nothing. The knocking stopped, but she could hear the faintest whisper, like a breath too close to her ear. "Leave." She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Claire told herself it was just her imagination. She had been working too hard, traveling too much, and exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. She tried to shake off the unease, burying herself in work for the day, but as the sun began to set, the feeling of dread returned. She reluctantly returned to her room, trying to tell herself that everything would be fine. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the air felt heavy again, pressing against her lungs like a vice. That night, the knocking returned, louder, more insistent. Claire sat up in bed, her breath shallow, straining her ears. The knocks were coming from the closet. Trembling, she approached it, inching the door open. Empty, but the air inside was freezing, so cold that she could see her breath. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with such force it nearly knocked her backwards. The temperature in the room dropped. Her heart raced as she felt something unseen moving in the air, a presence watching her, waiting. Desperate, Claire rushed downstairs to the front desk. The night manager on duty, a different man than the one who had checked her in, seemed unsurprised when she described the events. He simply sighed and said, "You're not the first." Confused and terrified, Claire pressed for more information. The manager leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, and told her about the history of room 308. In the late 1960s, a man named Joseph Wood had stayed in that room for several months. A drifter with no family, no friends, and no apparent purpose, Joseph had gradually become obsessed with the idea that the room was haunted. He claimed to hear voices, whispers in the walls telling him to do terrible things. Hotel staff at the time dismissed him as a lonely man losing his grip on reality. But then one night, Joseph snapped. In a fit of madness, he strangled a chambermaid who had entered to clean the room. When the police found him, he was sitting calmly on the bed, the maid's lifeless body at his feet, mumbling to himself. She wouldn't stop knocking. Joseph was arrested and taken to a psychiatric hospital where he later died. But since that night, every guest who had stayed in room 308 had reported strange occurrences. Knocking, whispers, and a feeling of suffocation, as if the room itself was alive and malevolent. Terrified, Claire demanded to be moved to a different room, but the manager shook his head. "You can try," he said, "but it won't help. Once it starts, it follows you." Desperate, Claire packed her things and left the Milburn Hotel that night, vowing never to return. But the horror didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, the knocking followed her. No matter where she stayed, the faint tapping would begin around 2 a.m., followed by the whispers, "Leave." She could feel the presence, like a shadow lingering just outside her vision, always watching, waiting. No matter how far she ran, it was with her. 2 months later, Claire's body was found in a small motel on the outskirts of Chicago. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the motel manager told a different story. He claimed that on the night she died, the guests in the rooms next to hers complained of loud knocking coming from her room, and when he went to check on her, he found the door locked from the inside. The only sound he could hear through the door was the faintest whisper, "Leave." By the time he forced the door open, Claire was already gone. In the winter of 2013, a young couple named Brian and Emily checked into a small, remote hotel nestled deep in the mountains of Colorado. They were on a weekend getaway, eager to spend time together away from the bustle of city life. The hotel was old, its once grand facade now weathered by decades of harsh winters. It stood on the edge of a dense forest, its isolation both charming and unnerving. Upon arrival, the elderly receptionist, a woman with thin, wispy white hair, welcomed them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As she handed them the keys to room 409, she hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something. But after a brief pause, she simply told them to enjoy their stay and reminded them that they were the only guests checked in for the weekend. Brian and Emily laughed off the eeriness of the empty hotel, chalking it up to off-season quiet. As they settled into room 409, they couldn't shake the sense that something felt off. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the hotel, and no matter how much they adjusted the thermostat, the chill remained. The windows overlooked the vast forest, and as the sun set, casting long shadows across the snow, the dense trees seemed to press closer, like silent sentinels standing watch. That night, Emily was the first to hear it, a faint sound, like someone tapping lightly on the window. She stirred, unsure if she had imagined it, but when she glanced over at Brian, he was still asleep. The tapping grew louder. Nervous, she got out of bed and moved toward the window, her breath visible in the frigid air. The snow outside was untouched, the branches of the nearby trees swaying gently in the wind. There was nothing there. She climbed back into bed, convincing herself it was just the wind playing tricks on her. But then at around 3 a.m., the sound returned. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the walls. Brian woke up this time, groggy and annoyed. "It's probably the old pipes," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. But the tapping was rhythmic now, deliberate, like someone knocking on the other side of the wall. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. The knocking seemed to be coming from in the room, just behind the wallpaper. Brian stood up, determined to find the source. But as soon as he touched the wall, the knocking stopped abruptly. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. And then from behind the closed door of their closet, there was a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. Emily's blood ran cold. Brian slowly approached the closet, his hand shaking as he reached for the door handle. With a deep breath, he yanked it open. The closet was empty, but the scratching continued, now louder, like claws raking across the walls from the inside. Brian and Emily stared at the closet in horror, watching as the thin wooden door began to tremble slightly, as if something on the other side was desperately trying to get out. Without a word, they grabbed their things and bolted out of the room, racing down the stairs. As they reached the lobby, they found the elderly receptionist sitting behind the desk, her eyes glassy, staring off into the distance. She didn't react as they approached, her hands resting motionless on the counter. Frantic, they explained what had happened, begging for another room, but the old woman simply smiled faintly and said, "There's nothing to be afraid of. He just wants to be let out." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "Who?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The receptionist's eyes shifted, locking onto Emily's. "The man who died in room 409. Brian's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" The receptionist's expression never changed. "Years ago, a man checked into that room and never left. They found him in the closet, clawing at the walls from the inside. Some say he went mad. Others say something in the room drove him to it. But every now and then, guests hear him, trying to get out." Emily's breath hitched in her throat. "Why didn't you tell us?" The receptionist's smile faded, because once you hear him, he follows you. Suddenly, the lights in the lobby flickered. The temperature dropped, and the faint sound of scratching began to echo through the room. It was coming from behind the walls, traveling through the hotel, getting closer. The couple stared at each other, terror tightening their chests. They fled from the hotel, refusing to look back. They drove through the snow-covered mountains, hearts pounding in their chests, but the feeling of being watched never left them. That night, as they finally reached a small motel hours away, They tried to convince themselves it was over. They had left the hotel. It couldn't follow them. But as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside, Emily heard it again, just as faint as before. A tapping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from behind the walls. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized he had found them. No matter how far they ran, they would never escape the man in room 409. It was the fall of 2006 when three friends, Mia, Alex, and Jordan, decided to take a road trip through the southern United States. They were adventurers at heart, always looking for the next thrill, and had heard rumors of an old abandoned hotel on the outskirts of a forgotten Louisiana town. The Magnolia Grand Hotel, once a luxurious destination in the 1920s, had been shut down after a series of tragic deaths, leaving it untouched for decades. Intrigued by the eerie history, the trio decided to check it out. When they arrived, the building loomed before them, massive and decayed, its windows broken, vines creeping up its walls like skeletal fingers. The surrounding area was silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. As they approached the entrance, the door creaked open, as if welcoming them inside. The hotel's interior was worse than they expected. Dust coated every surface, the once grand chandeliers now hanging at awkward angles, cracked and covered in cobwebs. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and old furniture sat rotting in the lobby. Despite the thick layer of neglect, the atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, as if the air itself carried the weight of everything that had happened there. "We're definitely not supposed to be here," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. But Alex, ever the fearless leader, pushed forward. "It's just an old building. So there's nothing here but our imagination." As they explored deeper, they found themselves drawn to the second floor. Jordan had heard a legend that this was where most of the deaths had occurred. They moved down the hall, their footsteps echoing against the rotting floorboards until they found it. Room 217. According to the stories, this was where the hotel's last guest, a woman named Evelyn Taylor, had met her grisly end. She had checked in, but no one had ever seen her leave. Days later, when the staff finally forced the door open, they found her dead, her body twisted unnaturally on the floor, her face frozen in a silent scream. No cause of death was ever determined. Jordan, always one for a dare, suggested they go inside. Mia hesitated, but Alex gave a mocking grin and pushed the door open. The room was mostly intact, though thick with dust. The bed was unmade, the sheets yellowed with age, as though someone had left in a hurry. A large oval mirror stood in the corner, its glass smeared with grime. The air was stiflingly cold. As they stepped inside, Mia immediately felt dizzy, like the room was spinning around her. The walls seemed to pulse, the air pressing down on her chest. "Guys, something's wrong. I don't feel right." Alex brushed it off, poking around the room, joking about what could have happened to Evelyn. Jordan, meanwhile, was drawn to the mirror. He wiped a hand across the glass to get a clearer view, but as soon as he did, his face went pale. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back. "What?" Alex asked, turning towards him. Jordan pointed to the reflection. There, in the dim light, they could see the three of them. But there was something else. A shadowy figure stood behind Mia, barely distinguishable but unmistakably there. Tall, with a face obscured in darkness, its hand outstretched towards her. "Mia, get out of there!" Jordan shouted, his voice cracking with terror. Mia spun around, but there was nothing behind her. "What are you talking about?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. "The mirror," Alex whispered, eyes wide, staring at the reflection. Mia turned toward the mirror, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The figure was still there, clearer now. It loomed behind her, its dark form solidifying, its face still hidden, but its hand was on her shoulder in the reflection. Yet she felt nothing. Her eyes locked onto the image as a wave of nausea hit her. Then, slowly, the figure's head turned, staring directly at her. Mia screamed, backing away from the mirror, her heart racing. But no matter how far she moved, the figure stayed in the reflection, its hand still on her shoulder, its head turning slowly to follow her movements. "We need to get out of here," Jordan stammered, pulling her toward the door. But as he tried to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. They were trapped. Suddenly, the room's temperature plummeted. Their breaths came out in misty clouds, and the lights flickered erratically. The mirror began to vibrate, a low humming noise filling the room. The figure in the reflection grew clearer. Its face was now visible. It was a woman. her features gaunt and twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror. It was Evelyn. She opened her mouth, and though no sound came, the reflection began to scream. The noise was deafening, as if it was coming from inside their own heads. Mia clutched her ears, falling to her knees, while Jordan frantically yanked at the door handle, desperate to escape. Alex, still frozen in place, stared at the mirror in horror as Evelyn's reflection began to claw at the glass, trying to get through. Suddenly, the mirror cracked. Thin lines spread across its surface like spider webs, and with each crack, the room seemed to tremble. Mia felt something cold brush against her back, and she turned around to see nothing but shadows creeping along the walls, swirling like smoke. The mirror shattered. A gust of icy wind rushed through the room, and in that instant, the door flew open. Without a second thought, the three of them bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. They stumbled down the stairs and burst through the front door of the hotel, gasping for air as they fled into the night. Once they reached the car, they didn't speak. Alex floored the gas pedal, and they drove in silence, their minds reeling from what had just happened. As they sped away from the hotel, Mia glanced at the rearview mirror. Her heart stopped. In the reflection seated in the back seat between Jordan and Alex was Evelyn, her twisted face grinning at her. In the summer of 2010, a college student named Sarah decided to take a solo trip to Japan before starting her final year. She had always been fascinated by the country's rich history and culture, especially its legends of haunted places. One such place caught her attention, a small, obscure hotel in the countryside, rumored to be cursed. The Asakura Inn, hidden deep in the mountains, had a dark history. Decades ago, it was a popular destination for travelers seeking tranquility, but something terrible happened in the 1950s. A young woman who had worked at the inn as a maid disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some said she had been murdered. Others believed she had taken her own life, her body never found. After her disappearance, guests reported strange occurrences, cold spots, whispers in the night, and doors opening and closing on their own. The inn slowly lost its business, and the owners abandoned it. But in the 1990s, a new family bought and renovated the inn, determined to restore its former glory. However, the rumors of the haunting never died, and the inn remained mostly empty, visited only by curious thrill seekers. Sarah, always up for an adventure, booked a room for 2 nights. When she arrived, the inn looked old but well-maintained. The owner, a quiet middle-aged man with a polite smile, greeted her and showed her to her room. A traditional tatami room with sliding paper doors. Everything seemed normal, even peaceful, but there was something off about the atmosphere. The inn was too quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. That night, after a long day of exploring the nearby town, Sarah returned to the inn, exhausted. She slid the door shut, changed into her yukata, and lay down on the futon. The room was still, the only sound, the faint chirping of crickets outside. She drifted off to sleep easily, but it wasn't long before she woke up. At first, Sarah couldn't tell what had roused her. The room was dark, except for the moonlight filtering through the thin paper walls. She turned over, trying to fall back asleep, but then she heard it, soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway outside her room. They were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing just outside the door. She sat up, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. She waited, listening, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, she convinced herself it must have been another guest or the owner walking through the inn. She lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, but sleep didn't come easily. A couple of hours later, Sarah awoke again. This time, something was different. The room felt colder, and she had the distinct feeling that she wasn't alone. She sat up, scanning the room in the dim light. At first, everything seemed normal, but then she noticed something strange. The sliding door that she had shut before going to bed was now slightly open. Just a crack, wide enough for someone to peer through. Her heart raced. She was certain she had closed it. For a moment, she considered calling the owner, but something about the situation felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she opened the door further, she would find something she didn't want to see. She cautiously stood up and moved towards the door, her hand trembling as she reached for it. Just as her fingers touched the edge, the door slid open a little more on its own. A cold gust of air swept into the room, and she froze. There in the doorway was a shadow, a figure standing just outside. It was a woman, her long black hair hanging down, obscuring her face. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly as if she were watching Sarah, even though her eyes were hidden beneath her hair. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure stepped into the room slowly, the soft rustling of fabric the only sound. As she got closer, Sarah could see that the woman was wearing an old-fashioned maid's uniform, tattered and stained, her bare feet leaving no prints on the tatami mat. Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman said nothing. She moved closer, her face still hidden by her hair. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, the woman stopped, just a few feet from Sarah, and lifted her head. Her hair parted, revealing her face, or rather, what should have been her face. There was nothing there. Where the woman's eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, like a porcelain mask with no features. Sarah screamed, stumbling backwards and falling to the floor. The faceless woman tilted her head as if curious, and then turned slowly, drifting back towards the door. Before she left, she whispered something, so soft it was almost inaudible, but Sarah could swear she heard the words. "Find me." The door slid shut behind the woman with a quiet thud, leaving Sarah alone in the freezing room. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her eyes glued to the door, half expecting it to open again. But it didn't. The next morning, pale and shaken, Sarah went down to the lobby to check out. The owner noticed her distress and asked if everything was all right. Hesitant, she told him about the woman she had seen. His expression darkened, and he asked her to sit down. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, confused. "Who is she?" The owner sighed heavily. "The woman who disappeared all those years ago. She was a maid here, and some say her spirit still roams the inn, searching for something or someone. No one knows what happened to her, but those who see her often hear her whisper one thing before she disappears." Sarah's blood ran cold as the owner continued. "She always says, 'Find me.'" Terrified, Sarah left the inn that morning and never looked back. But even as she returned to her normal life, she couldn't shake the feeling that the faceless woman was still with her, watching, waiting. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Sarah would wake up and feel the cold air brush against her skin, and she could swear she heard soft footsteps just outside her door. And every time a whisper echoed in her mind, "Find me." In the early 1990s, a business traveler named Mark found himself stranded in a small, forgotten town deep in the Midwest after his car broke down during a heavy storm. The rain was relentless, and with no way to get back on the road, he was forced to find a place to stay for the night. The only available lodging was an old, run-down hotel that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Its neon sign flickered dimly in the downpour. The Hollow Creek Inn. The hotel gave off an unsettling vibe as soon as Mark entered. The lobby was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling, and the air smelled damp, like the place had been sealed off from the outside world for far too long. The man at the front desk barely looked up when Mark approached. He was old, hunched over, his skin paper-thin, his voice a whisper, as he handed Mark the key to room 303. Mark felt a wave of unease wash over him, but brushed it off. It was just one night, and he had no other options. The elevator groaned as it carried him to the third floor. When the doors creaked open, he was met with a long, narrow hallway, its carpets faded and stained, the lights flickering erratically. The sound of the storm outside was muted, but every once in a while, the building seemed to groan under the weight of the wind. Room 303 was at the far end of the hallway. When Mark unlocked the door, the handle felt colder than the rest of the building, almost like it had been frozen over. The room itself was plain, old-fashioned, with outdated furniture and a thick layer of dust coating the surfaces. There was no television, only a small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall and a single window that looked out into the darkness. As Mark settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm outside howled, making the walls of the hotel creak and moan, but it was more than that. The room felt wrong. It was too quiet, as if the walls were absorbing the noise. He tried to dismiss it as nerves, tired from a long day of travel, and laid down on the creaky bed, hoping to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, Mark was jolted awake by a strange sound, a low, rhythmic thumping. At first, he thought it was just the storm, but as he lay there, the noise grew louder. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was coming from the hallway, just outside his door. Thump, thump, thump. Mark sat up, his heart pounding. The sound was steady, like footsteps. Slowly, he got out of bed, his skin prickling with fear, and crept toward the door. He pressed his ear against it, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then suddenly there was a soft knock, 3 light taps as if someone was standing right outside his door. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He didn't dare move. The knock came again, this time more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Swallowing his fear, he reached for the door handle and pulled it open just a crack, enough to peek into the hallway. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, lit only by the flickering lights, the old wallpaper casting eerie shadows along the walls. But the air felt different, heavier, colder. He stepped into the hall, glancing around, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. Shaking his head, Mark closed the door and went back to bed. Trying to convince himself it was just the wind or his mind playing tricks on him. But as soon as he lay back down, he heard it again. This time, it was louder, coming from inside the room. The rhythmic thumping echoed through the small space, coming from the wall right behind the bed. Thump, thump, thump. Mark bolted upright, his heart racing. He stared at the wall, unsure of what to do. Then the thumping stopped, and a low, whispering voice filled the room, barely audible but unmistakable. Let me in. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it sent a wave of terror through Mark. He jumped out of bed, backing away from the wall. The voice came again, louder this time. Let me in. Mark's pulse quickened as he stared at the wall. Suddenly, the mirror on the opposite side of the room began to vibrate, a faint buzzing sound filling the air. He watched in horror as handprints began to appear on the surface of the mirror, as if something was pressing against it from the other side, trying to push through. The handprints were large, distorted, the fingers long and thin, stretching the glass as if it were bending under the weight of whatever was trapped inside. Mark stumbled back, his back hitting the door. The whispering voice grew more frantic, louder, and the thumping resumed, this time from inside the walls all around him. Let me in. He couldn't take it anymore. Mark grabbed his bag and fled the room, not daring to look back as he ran down the hallway toward the elevator. The lights overhead flickered more violently now, and as he sprinted toward the lobby, he could swear he heard footsteps behind him, chasing him. When he reached the lobby, the old man at the front desk was still there, motionless, his eyes following Mark as he ran past. Mark didn't stop. He burst through the front doors into the pouring rain and ran to his car, not caring that it was broken down. He just needed to get as far away from the hotel as possible. The next morning, Mark managed to get a tow truck to the nearest mechanic. He tried to explain to the driver about the hotel, the strange noises, the voice, but the man just gave him a strange look. "The Hollow Creek Inn?" the driver asked. "That place hasn't been open for over 20 years. It burned down in the 80s. Mark's blood ran cold. "No, that's impossible. I stayed there last night." The driver shook his head. "Can't be. Place burned down with people still inside. There's nothing left but the foundation and some rubble." Mark insisted, but the driver wouldn't budge. Confused and shaken, Mark asked to be driven back to the spot. When they arrived, his heart nearly stopped. There was no hotel, only the charred remains of a foundation, overgrown with weeds and debris. The Hollow Creek Inn hadn't existed in years, yet somehow Mark had spent the night there and something or someone had tried to get in.